Thank you all for coming out here. I know it's both a cold time of year and it's also like holiday type time, and most people are at places that are not the frigid Northeast, so I appreciate you sticking around because I'm sure you did it just for me and just for this talk on global health, because staying in frigid temperature is not at all bad for your health or anything. So for today, we're going to go through a couple major things. I want to take a look at, because the topic, like a few that we've done here, is, hello, welcome, is gigantic, because there are so many things we can talk about. I'm going to try to break it down into a few areas that are particularly useful, and then some sub areas within there. So here's basically what we're going to be looking at today. We'll take a look at health issues in the developing world, then we'll shift to looking at the developed or overdeveloped, depending on who you talk to, world, and then finally we'll look at some global issues that transcend all of these boundaries and especially our larger concerns on the horizon. The primary objective, for today, at least from my perspective, is to give you an idea of the challenges the world is facing in terms of health over the next 25, 30, 40 years. This is sort of the long perspective. It'll give us a bit of background in terms of where we've come from, and also in the case of some of the things that are ongoing problems, what potential solutions we might consider might be. We can talk more at the end if we have time about which of those solutions we think might be good or bad, what some of the upsides and downsides to them are. So, everyone clear on where we're going, what we got? Got questions, feel free to throw them at me. I may defer some of those to the end because I want to make sure we do have the chance to get through everything. But if I do that, write it down or something because I do want to get to your question. It's just a timing issue, not a content issue. So let's start off with the developing world. First major issue I want to talk about there is HIV/AIDS, because this is something that the developed world or the more industrialized world has generally done a pretty good job of combating. Back in the 80s, we stumbled a lot in dealing with it, and partially because it was so new. But we've caught up, and we've done a pretty good job in a lot of places, not as good a job in other places. If you look, one of the highest, these numbers indicate whether the number of cases that are reported yearly, if we're getting more cases on average per year, new cases of HIV/AIDS or fewer. So if you look to North America, for example, there are approximately 70,000 people in North America and Europe that are living with HIV/AIDS. The number of new diagnoses has gone down 8%. This data is about a year old, so from 2017 to the beginning of 2018. All of this is from Avert. It's a nonprofit in the UK that has done a ton of work on HIV research and on outreach to help people there. So here we generally have been going down. Where the highest rate of increase is, interestingly, is actually Eastern Europe and in Central Asia. This is something that's been overlooked a lot. But former Soviet bloc countries, Eastern Europe in general, Russia as well, rising instances of AIDS there, or HIV/AIDS. Just to make the distinction, HIV is the virus which causes AIDS. Not everyone who has HIV has what we call AIDS, which is the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. That's the whole package of your body responding to it. You can have HIV and be non-symptomatic, not display any of the weakened immune system stuff. The virus is in your body, but it's just sort of hanging out there waiting to do damage eventually, but hasn't actually started to degrade things. That's one reason we use both of those terms, because the populations that you look at and the symptoms that people evidence are different depending on whether they just have the virus or whether the full syndrome has manifested, and the time between first infection and full syndrome can vary dramatically, oftentimes over the course of years, if not more. So, with that aside, high rates of increase there, decreased rates of increase, if you look in Africa in particular, like the numbers in Africa are fairly large compared to other parts of the world. There are a bunch of reasons for that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail here in a minute. But the rate at which the transmission is occurring, especially in Central and Southern Africa, has actually been going down. We've made a lot of strides in South Africa in particular in terms of dealing with the transmission rate of AIDS and trying to decrease that over the last few years. If you look up here into the Middle East, generally they've been having more problems, not less, even though the total number of cases is a lot smaller. So here are the few basic things to look at. Africa is clearly the hardest hit here. That's the area that's been having the most problems. Close to 1 million people in Eastern and Southern Africa are infected with the HIV virus. There are a few things that directly get here. We talked about the significant rise in those areas. This concept is important, and this is one reason why I divided the overall issues that we were going to look at into the developing and the developed world, because a lot of health concerns are related to the affluence level of the country, the level of infrastructure that exists in that country, access to sanitation, which we'll go into in quite a bit here, but also access to medical services, access to effective prevention, access to effective care. It's a lot harder to get that in some parts of the world than in others. For HIV/AIDS in particular, there's a big there's a big difference between how quickly we can get testing done, how well people know that they need to be tested and when testing is appropriate, and having the facilities to do that, turn that information around as well. The other part of what's interesting here, it goes to this next slide. Oh, nope, I lied. One more thing before we go to the next slide. One of the most significant transmission vectors are actually soldiers. This is something that I wasn't aware of until I started looking into it more. But one of the reasons why we've got so many problems in a lot of these areas is in conflict zones, it becomes a lot harder to manage this kind of thing. Once you've got HIV/AIDS, there are a number of different drugs that we have that can significantly reduce your viral load. It doesn't eliminate the disease, but it makes it much harder to pass on, and it also significantly mitigates the symptoms of it. But those usually require very constant, consistent access to a specific set of drugs that's taken very regularly without disruption. If your hometown is in the process of being bombed, it's a little harder to get your prescription refilled. And that ends up being some of the problem in a number of these areas, especially where forced migration becomes an issue. Arguably, that's one of the reasons why we're seeing increases in the Middle East. The Syrian civil war probably has an impact on some of that. In particular, in southern Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, we've seen significant problems there. We'll talk about conflict in general as sort of a multiplier factor when it comes to global health, but HIV/AIDS, those things are concerns, but also soldiers are a significant infection vector, especially in Africa. Estimates vary, but between 10 and 20% of the armed forces in Africa are HIV positive. And when soldiers go from place to place, for reasons we could get into, there are no kids in the room, so we can, yeah. You all know what I'm talking about. Yeah, soldiers and things, and you think you might die tomorrow, and so stuff happens. But there are also significant instances of rape being used as a weapon of war, which is horrifying on a number of levels, but also increases the spread here as well. So the being able to help solve conflict issues in countries can actually do a lot to also help combat this problem, even though they aren't ones that we usually think of as intertwined with one another. They really are in this case. Second, there's a goal that the UN set. This was about a few years back, well, a few decades back. They wanted to get to 90-90-90 by 2010. Here's what that meant. They wanted 95% of the people who had HIV/AIDS to be aware of their status, so to have been tested and know that they were HIV positive. Second, they wanted 90% of the people there to be on HIV treatment, because again, we have pretty effective treatments that can mitigate a lot of the symptoms and can decrease transmission. And that's the last part. They wanted to get 90% of people what are called virally suppressed, which is where the amount of the virus in their system is so low that it is not easily passed on to other people. So that's the goal. We made a fair amount of progress there from 2000 till about now. We've kind of stalled out recently. So we've stalled out at around the 70 to 80% mark, and we're having a lot of trouble pushing much beyond that. There's a bunch of literature on why that may be the case. The short answer is, well, that's actually a little overly simplified. The main things that are keeping us from doing it are factors that are outside of the healthcare sector. So there are things like conflict, like forced migration, like limited education campaigns, that sort of thing. Other factors involved as well. So here, sexual violence is actually a key driver in HIV transmission. Instances of sexual violence, people who have had that experience are much more likely to end up becoming HIV positive, both because of the nature in which the sexual encounters in that context occur, but also because that's something where they don't have the opportunity to vet a partner, have their partner tested before things happen or anything along those lines. So this is another instance where dealing with a larger social concern may end up having a significant effect on the spread of HIV/AIDS. Secondary thing, or tertiary thing, the U.S. has a policy, and this flips with every Democratic or Republican shift. Something, we call it now the Mexico City rule. It's been called different things over time. The global gag order or global gag rule is another term that gets used for it. It's a policy, goes back to actually, I think, before Clinton, but it basically says that if the U.S. provides funding to a non-governmental organization, if that organization cannot use any of that funding to provide abortion. That's what the rule says. And every Republican president since before Clinton has signed that into law on their first day, and every Democratic president has undone that on their first day, which is all kinds of fun if you're an NGO trying to plan what your budget's going to look like when a third of your funding just disappears because a US election went a certain way. Something happened that's unique on this in 2017, though. On Trump's first day, like previous Republican presidents, he signed a law to put this back in effect, but he expanded that law significantly. The way it had worked previously is there's actually a law that Congress passed a while back. This is unnecessary in this component. Congress passed a law that said no U.S. funding can go to provide abortions. No real dispute on that. That's not really an issue that's up for discussion. What the global gag order had done was kind of go a half step further than that and say that if you, even if you aren't using this money for abortion, if anywhere in your services you provide abortion, we won't give you money. So if you're an organization that operates a tuberculosis clinic over here, you operate a family planning clinic over here that also provides abortion, you operate a anti-meningitis area over here, if the U.S. cannot give you money if one of your clinics does that thing. That's what the global gag order says. The legislation says the U.S. can't give money to that clinic. You follow the difference between those two? Trump went one step further than that and said that if your organization provides information about abortion or directs people to abortion services or lets them know it is an alternative that they could use, we will not provide any funding to you. And that ended up cutting funding to most of the largest family planning organizations in the world. Africa in particular ran into a lot of problems here because it's very difficult, especially when you have a lot of people who are victims of rape and incest and sexual violence, who are oftentimes very young. Like a 13-year-old comes in and is pregnant. It's very hard from the perspective of the people running those clinics to justify not letting them know that there is a way they could terminate their pregnancy if they chose. Again, we can debate whether that's right or wrong or whether they should or should not do that, but the effect of the policy has been to limit any U.S. foreign aid to a large range of non-governmental organizations, which has made it a lot harder to do AIDS education awareness as well, because the same organizations that provide family planning services and teach people about how to use birth control and whatnot also talk to them about AIDS prevention. And they lose funding if any of the information they provide relates to abortion in any way as an option. So, a complicating factor, the U.S. doesn't, as we discussed a couple times back, the U.S. doesn't actually provide all that much in foreign aid, so it's not that it's not as big a factor as it might be, but it's definitely something that that complicates the issue a bit. That was mostly where we're going. Any questions on HIV/AIDS stuff? Yeah.
How expensive is HIV medication?
It's gotten a lot better than it used to be, but still generally pretty pricey. There are generic versions of a lot of it that the drug companies have sometimes agreed to make available to the third world or to the developing world. That is sort of the cheaper version. But one of the other things that will happen, we'll talk more about pharmaceuticals in particular when we get to the developed world and the effects that it has. So I'm going to hold on to part of that question. The short version is name brand stuff still super pricey. Like if you want the top shelf stuff, that's really expensive. There are generics of that can be sold some places but not others based on patent laws. The issue is, so when you go to make a drug, you have an exclusive patent on that drug for generally about 20 years. You don't actually get all that time because you have to do FDA testing for some of that. But you got an exclusive patent then. And so in the US, if someone tries to make a generic version of your drug, you get to sue them and run them out of business, because that's the idea. Because people won't invent something if someone else can just steal what you invented 2 days later. You dumped all the research and development money in there, then someone else makes your drug 5 days later and takes all the profit. Like no one would develop anything if we didn't have patents for drug development. That's part of the idea. So in the US, making generic versions of those things in that 20-year time window isn't really doable. But in Djibouti, they're not really going to worry about trying to track you down and prosecute you if you're making a generic version of whatever that drug is. So to some degree, that's more accessible there, and pharmaceutical companies have decided it's not worth the PR hit to go after people who are potentially breaching it in those areas. So that makes it closer to being affordable for some people. Does that speak to your question at all?
Yeah, I got one other another question.
Sure.
So with these drugs, is there any complacency about behavior?
And there are a few things here. None of them, well, so for one thing, if 1 in 5 people in your population is HIV positive, I don't know that anyone is really complacent about the risks that face them, and that I think they're a lot more sanguine about the likelihood that that's something they'll run into, as opposed to someplace like the US now, where that is a risk, but it's not a tremendously insane risk from a single encounter. So I think that is one part of it. dealing with some of the cultural expectations about what is and is not appropriate, condom usage, all that kind of stuff is an additional part of what happens in addition to just medication for people once they do have it. So there are multiple components to it if that kind of speaks to the issue. Next issue in terms of the developing world is the sanitation gap. And this is actually a huge issue. There is a massive disparity in the access to clean water and clean sewer in different parts of the world. In the United States, there are some places, I think it's something like 98% of folks in the United States have regular access to clean running water. And there are some parts of rural areas that don't. I had some friends who had a well in their backyard and got their water from there. They've moved to running water, I think, since then, but you get the idea. In other parts of the world, that is nowhere near as true. There are about 2 billion people in the world that lack access to toilets. And in addition to just being gross, which is unfortunate, it's also got some sizable sanitary and health implications that go along with that. There are tons of different kinds of bacteria that get much more easily passed when you don't have sanitary facilities. So that gets us here. There are tons of diseases, in particular diseases that cause diarrhea, that spread very easily in these settings, and diarrhea is actually one of the #1 killers of children around the world because it dehydrates people so severely. And when you're a kid, it's very hard to get that back, especially if you also have difficulty accessing clean water. So approximately 2.2 million children die every single year due to that, largely again in the developing world. That gets us to this issue, and that's that sanitation relative to population, so in general, more people, a larger percentage of the population has access to clean sanitation now than did in 2000. We have been making consistent progress there around the world, which is great news. But we still have a long way to go to get to where we need to go, and that's something where additional support and additional help goes a long way. So projects that countries around the world and that NGOs do continue to be incredibly important, but we're going in the right direction, just not as quickly as we might hope. Let's talk conflict, because this ends up being a magnifying factor for almost every other issue we talk about. War and conflict just compound pretty much every problem you can think about, because everything from getting access to a doctor and medical facilities to having a clean sanitary place to give birth, to having someplace to regularly get medication, to having someplace to get checkups, to having disinfectants to deal with wounds, to encountering people who have diseases that you have never encountered before and have no immunity to. All of these things expand in the case of conflict, to say nothing about wounds and violence and things that come from that area. Refugees, along with that, the migration of people from place to place, again, complicates access to all of these systems. But more than that, it also ends up meaning that a lot of these people lack access to good sanitation. I don't know about you, but I don't generally carry my toilet with me when I flee my home from an attack. Do any of you like porcelain over the shoulder? Nobody? Nobody? Yeah. Hey, that was funnier in my head, apparently. I taught middle school kids a day or two ago, so maybe my brain is in a different place. Anyway, lack of clear sanitation access is one problem, so everything we just talked about in terms of sanitation gets magnified here. But second, clean water access also becomes a really big problem. You don't have the chance to get access to running water in a lot of cases. You have to rely on water purification or boiling water, but you may not have the opportunity to sit down, set a fire, and do that while you're running from gunfire. So all of these things further complicate. Even more so, and this is more a case when it comes to Syria, though it's also a huge issue when it comes to Africa as well. Refugee camps are a great idea conceptually in that people have a place to be where there is some degree of safety. But as those camps expand, often well beyond the capacity of what they were designed to serve, not only do we have less security there, we tend to have less sanitation because we have more people than the sanitary services can deal with, but we also end up getting a lot more disease spreading in between individuals. That kind of overcrowding complicates everything. And the more conflicts you have, the more of this kind of stuff that you have. So wars and fighting and conflict, again, even though it seems tangential, is actually a core part of world health and about how the health infrastructure across the planet works. And I think it's another good example of how the topic is super broad, but in a lot of ways that's a good thing, because it means there are a lot of potential angles to attack it from, a lot of ways to help mitigate these problems that have nothing to do with doctors or the Red Cross or vaccines, though those are also, all good. But it means that a lot of different tools that we have can be applicable here. One of the other issues that happens in terms of conflict that we often don't think about is the displacement of agricultural sectors. You get chased off your land, and that happens to a bunch of people. Now, no one is growing the food that your country and the people around you are going to need to survive the next winter. So famine tends to very frequently accompany conflict, or in other cases tends to provoke conflict. There's a good argument that the famine in Syria and parts of the Middle East is a good chunk of what prompted the Arab Spring, and is also a good chunk of what prompted the Syrian civil war, because once the price of bread began to escalate because of the famine, people got more and more agitated and demanded more help from their government and started pushing their government, and the government, because it's Syria, pushed back in a rather hard and explosive sort of way, voila, civil war. So instances like famine and displacement are not only the effect of conflict, they can be the cause of conflict as well. So again, it's an instance where being able to potentially do something on the food level may actually head off the conflict level, which ends up driving a ton of other problems. So lots of different avenues for interaction. Communicable disease also becomes really hard to contain. I don't know if any of y'all have followed, there were reports about a month or two ago that we were getting new cases of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And after the Ebola outbreak that we had a few years back, that's something that's on people's mind, like Ebola is really not good. And part of the issue is, in order to contain Ebola, you got to do a couple things. You got to keep patients isolated, so you need to set up strict quarantines. You need to make sure that bodies are disposed of properly, because the bodies of people who die of Ebola are incredibly infectious. So a lot of traditional burial practices, like we used to do until fairly recently, you'd have the body in the home, like for a day. That's where the wake tradition, heck, that's why we used to call living rooms used to be called parlors. We started calling them living rooms. We no longer kept corpses there because we had funeral homes as a thing more often. Like, this is something that is not very far removed from the traditions that we were more used to. And so, but that tradition, if you try to do that, or even if you try to stay with someone who has Ebola until they expire, you're very likely to end up catching it in the process and then spreading it to other people. Add into that some of the religious obligations in terms of burial ceremonies and what's expected and what's necessary, a number of which don't necessarily comport with the most sanitary or sterile way to do burials, and you have the recipe for a lot of problems. So Ebola, problem in general, but because quarantine is such an important part of it, again, if people are fleeing conflict, it's really, really tough to quarantine them. And so that's one reason why the Democratic Republic of Congo in particular is such a concern. The DRC, like World War III has basically been going on in the DRC for the last 20 or 30 years, but because it's Africa, none of us care. Sorry, but we just don't, at least in the broader scheme of things. Not us in particular, because maybe we do, but like in terms of international policy, the world doesn't really care all that much. Partially because it's super hard to solve, much like most world wars, but also because it's the middle of Africa, so we don't pay attention all that much because it doesn't run into any other country's interests in a very direct way. But the conflict going on there continues to perpetuate a lot of the health problems that we're seeing, both because it moves people from place to place, also because it thwarts any attempt to quarantine infectious disease as it springs up, also because it makes it very hazardous for doctors to go there and help, because there's a great chance if you're a doctor who's there to help people, one of the groups that's fighting is going to abduct you and make them help their soldiers instead of helping the population. So you run into all kinds of additional trouble that shows up. Last, non-lethal casualties. We talk a lot about the people who die in wars, and that's truly tragic. But people who are wounded and survive are tremendously vulnerable to infection and also much less able to care for themselves in many cases, both because of psychological issues, but also because of physical issues. So the walking wounded and other people in that category become a whole nother concern in terms of health. Think about the United States and soldiers who have come back here from Iraq and Afghanistan and how much care we should, in theory, be giving to those people and don't always. Y'all vaguely with me, right? Like there's a lot that goes on that's bad in a war that affects people physically and mentally, and we have, in theory, some of the best healthcare in the world and still have a lot of problems dealing with it. So compare that to places where there is essentially no healthcare infrastructure, or whatever infrastructure was there got bombed 3 days ago by a rebel group, and you can see how the problem gets even worse. Questions on conflict, or any other questions on the developing world in general, because our next point of movement is going to be to the developed world, on things that we here in the United States and in similar countries deal with. Go for it.
I have 2 questions.
Please.
Just to confirm, the developing world, how do you define that?
Great question. No clear definition. What we would generally, you can think industrial or pre-industrialized world, non-industrialized being another way to look at it. Generally, the OECD, which is the organization of, I used to have this memorized, Organization of Economically, OECD, yeah. OEDC, yeah.
Cooperation and development.
That, what he said. It's that. Sorry, too many acronyms jumbled in my head. Thank you, Neil. That is generally an organization that will track where countries are relative to other ones and what general tier they fall in. Here we're usually talking about countries that don't have massive industrialization. A lot of Africa falls there. Some parts of Southeast Asia fall there as well. You also get areas, most of Eastern Europe falls above this thing. The term third world is a term that we used to use because we were the first world. The Soviets in their eyes were the second world, and everybody who wasn't cool enough to be part of either of those groups was the third world. Which has some problematic assumptions with it. But that set aside, that was the old way of referring to it. The global south is another term that you'll sometimes hear used to apply to these groups, because incidentally, they almost all tend to be south of the equator for reasons that bear a lot more geopolitical explanation to get to. But does that kind of give you an idea of where we're talking about?
South America?
Yep, some parts of South America would fit there as well, and Central America too.
Okay. My second question, there was an interesting segment on NPR several weeks ago where they were talking about what the most dangerous animal in the world was.
A mosquito, I assume.
It was a mosquito, yes. And I wondered if in your research you come up with anything
Oh, yes.
that and how
Yeah.
it's impacting global health.
You are about 47 minutes ahead of me.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
When we get to global issues, that actually becomes relevant because the habitat for mosquitoes is expanding. And so it's taking problems that used to be localized to some areas and spreading them much more significantly. Yeah, straight up.
Just not the developing world then.
It's something that they worried about more there than here historically, but that is beginning to change. So great observation, you're just a little ahead of me. So let's talk more developed world, developed countries. I'm going to focus largely on the United States, though a number of these echo through Europe and other similarly developed nations as well. First major issue is obesity. This is something, it's interesting in that part of the world deals with malnutrition and famine, part of the world deals with obesity. One would think these two problems could be evened out, but no. Partially because the problem is not just access to food or not access, it's also about the quality of food and the nature of food and what's added into that food. So let's take a look at the details. In terms of significance, obesity tends to shorten life expectancy by around 4 to 7 years, is the medical consensus at this point. And it's associated with about 10 to 25% of the deaths in the developed world. So whether that's heart disease, whether that's complications from diabetes, any of those sorts of things. Heart disease technically falls up there toward the top of the list, but in a lot of cases, obesity is contributed to that. So that's how it gets in there as being significantly responsible. So big problem. Multiple causes, and we're still, as a medical community, not we, I'm not part of that community, they, as a medical community, are still trying to sort out and break down how much these different factors are responsible, though there's probably a fair amount of blame to go around. First off is sedentary work environment. Especially in the United States, we have transitioned further and further away from quote-unquote blue-collar jobs into white-collar jobs, right? And as that transition happens, it means that even if you may have standing desks at work sometimes, which still don't actually do a lot for you, there are a lot of things that in order for us to economically survive mean we need to sit at a cubicle or in a cubicle for hours on end, and that limits a lot of what we can do. There's a secondary component, which is our lifestyle outside of work has also contributed to that to a decent degree, though the studies suggest that is less significant than the change in work environment just because that's less consistent and it's something that can change a lot more. I can't really opt to go, bend girders for 4 hours instead of typing at my computer. My boss is not going to be a fan of that option. But I can choose to go for a run in the park today instead of watching TV. I may not, and that's a separate issue, but at least that option exists and people can respond to suggestions related to that. So the work environment's part of it. This one is huge, and I personally, well, by association, take a lot of the blame because I'm from Iowa. This is our fault. Other people too, like Nebraska, Illinois, they get some blame. South Dakota, North Dakota, not as much. But Kansas. High fructose corn syrup is one of the most significant recent things that has added to obesity. And here's what happens. Producing corn syrup, producing corn in the United States, yay, and historically you did that, you made a profit, life was good. Now we produce more corn than we can sell at an effective price. The government subsidizes it. They give farmers money to keep growing it because we want them to grow stuff, and the agriculture industry really wants that. So we get money to keep doing it, but we can't really sell a lot of that corn here in the US because there's only so much corn on the cob we're going to eat. Cornbread is great, but lots of it. So what happens instead, ethanol, if you've heard of the corn-based ethanol thing, yeah, that's Iowa's fault too. It kind of works, but is not ideal. High fructose corn syrup has been the major innovation in the food industry in the last 30 years or so, where they've taken corn, they've condensed it down into corn syrup, and then they've used that to flavor food. And you would be amazed at the kind of food that has sugar added to it. Bread generally has sugar added to it, often a teaspoon or two per loaf minimum. We consume about the equivalent of 22 teaspoons of sugar a day. That's not just like a sugar in an apple that has naturally occurring. This is added sugar that has been piled onto stuff. This doesn't even count freaking Frosted Flakes or any of that. This is food that you wouldn't think of as being sugared. We have done that to. And a lot of that is because our bodies respond positively to it. We're like, ooh, sugar. I admit I am something of a sugar addict. That's not actually a thing, but if it were, I would be one. I've got a bit of a sweet tooth. A lot of folks do, and we have been conditioned to, and that gets us to eat more than we probably should because it's triggering different responses in our brain. And especially if we've been raised from a young age and been exposed to that higher level of sugar since then, it's like cutting off a drug that people have been used to for a long time. The crash off of it is always a lot harder than not starting it in the first place. And especially if you've been raised on it since an early age, it becomes a big problem. I put a lot of the blame for this at the feet of both the food industry and the agriculture industry, because from the ag industry's perspective, they want to sell more stuff, and this is a thing they can turn one of their chief products into and sell it, so that's good for them. From the food industry's perspective, they want us to eat more stuff, and so making food something that we enjoy eating, not because it is healthy, or even necessarily because it's tasty, though that's a part of it, but if it's something that will get us to eat more, that's good for them, even if it has some negative consequences for us. So on average, we tend to eat about 330, or rather consume about 330 calories a day just in added sugar, not counting anything else. And that's changed since around the 1980s and 1990s. So that, I think, is a significant factor that often gets overlooked. Third, Iowa, again, subsidies for corn, wheat, and soy. Cheap, empty calories, right? You remember how have y'all ever seen like the old school food pyramid, right? Where it was this many servings of grain, and then it was this many of fruits and veggies, and meat and milk, and then fats and stuff at the top. That whole tons of servings of grain is not medically accurate. That is not actually what your body needs. You need about equal proportions of each of those different groups, roughly speaking, not more grains and cereals than anything else. That pyramid was designed by the people who sold freaking grains and cereals. And so we educated an entire generation of our population to say, you've got to eat more of these sorts of empty calorie type things because that's supposed to be part of your diet. As we become used to that, that then is what we continue to replicate, and that means we take in less content that is actually usable for our body and more that gets stored as fat. Beyond that, fast food portion size, huge part of this. It's always interesting. I don't know how many of y'all have traveled outside the country very often. Think about the portion sizes you get in the US compared to what you get elsewhere. It's astounding in terms of the difference. Like, we overload the crap out of people. Think about the whole supersize phenomenon, right? We make a lot out. So if you're a restaurant owner, you never want people to leave your restaurant feeling hungry, right? Because that's a poor reflection on you, and they're not going to generally talk about it very well. So you up your portion size a bit. But as soon as I up my portion size a little above average to make sure that way people are always filled at my restaurant, then the person next to me is like, well, now people are getting used to that. I don't want them to think my portions are small. And then the other person's like, well, now their portions are bigger. I want to feel like I'm the one who's giving people a better deal and more food. Arms race, and now we gorge ourselves. So eating out at restaurants becomes a part of this. Also, the fast food aspect becomes a part of this. The inclusion of soda with fast food drinks. Massive change in the way that things work in terms of both the quantity of soda. Have you seen the cups at the movies? Much less drive-thrus, right? The sheer amount of that are all things that contribute to this issue. Less home cooking is another huge part of this. And this is not because necessarily people are lazy, though I think we might be able to make some of that argument, but a huge part of it is the way economically our country has moved itself, especially since the 70s forward. We have shifted to where a two-person income is largely a requirement in order for a family of four to stay afloat. That definitely was not the case up until mid-60s or so. It began to shift then. It really shifted when we started to change income tax distribution and some other things in the 70s. Now it has become largely expected and necessary to have two incomes to sustain a family, which means there is not a person at home to do said cooking, be they male, female, non-gender, whoever. Nobody's at home to do it. And that also means people statistically now are working longer hours than they have been before, in large part because minimum wage has not come close to keeping up with inflation. Right now, the minimum wage hasn't received a significant bump. Like Massachusetts is in okay shape because we're kind of, well, not okay, but we're better than a lot of places, partially because our cost of living is higher. But federal minimum wage hasn't received a significant change in decades. And we had small bumps, but nothing close to keeping up with inflation. So it means if you're working a minimum wage job, you are probably working 50 to 60 hours a week in order to do what you could do working 35 to 40 hours a week decades ago. That means, again, no time left to do this kind of thing. It also means that in a lot of those cases, companies tend to hire people part-time rather than full-time. Being hired with benefits, much less common now than it used to be. So a lot of folks, especially on the lower end of the economic system, end up having 2 to 3 20-hour-a-week jobs. But for each of those, you have to add commuting time on both ends of it. So again, it's eating up more time out of their day than anything else did before. Short version is we are working longer and harder for less money, and that's also leaving us less time to do basic things that keep us healthy. And so especially, and this isn't even getting into single parent homes and how difficult things can be there, but even for dual incomes, this has become an ascending problem. And it's not necessarily a matter of people making bad choices, though that's probably a component of it as well. I could definitely be less tubby if I ate fewer Cheetos. I'll take some blame for that. But I'll also note that that structurally we have made it more difficult for people to make the right choices. Think about it this way. Go to the supermarket and see how much a bag of Cheetos costs you as opposed to a bag of apples. Go through a fast food place and ask for bottled water instead of soda. Water is more expensive than soda. Let me let that sink in for a second. Water, which they use to make soda, is more expensive than the soda they make from the water and other stuff. Dude! Right? The major difference there, salads at McDonald's, look at the price of a salad versus the price of a hamburger. Salads are inevitably more expensive. They are seen as almost luxuries or signs of status in some cases. So we have made it structurally much more difficult for people to do what is healthy compared to what has happened before. Again, this doesn't absolve folks of responsibility, but it does note that there are some very strong headwinds that are present now that have not always been present. And thus it's not entirely, I don't think it's entirely right to make a direct comparison between how people in previous generations have done it and how people have done it now, because I don't necessarily think that entire generations just randomly decide to be lazy and dumb. Some of us, I do sometimes, but not on the whole. I'll get off my soapbox. Go ahead.
Why is soda more expensive than water?
Water is more why do they charge more?
Yeah.
Because they can. I will confess, 2 days ago I went to McDonald's, I got a bottle of water there because I'm like, I'm gonna be slightly less unhealthy than I might otherwise be. Water for me! 50 cents added to the charge on my meal. That's how it goes. Genetics, and in particular what are called epigenetic changes, are also a part of this. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because our time's limited, but while our genetics largely haven't changed all that much, epigenetics, which is about which genetic traits we have get expressed in certain ways, those have started to change a little bit. There's a complicated mitochondrial thing that's involved in how those work, but the upshot is slightly different genes are beginning to be activated in different populations. Again, this one, in retrospect, I probably shouldn't have even put it on the list because it's a much bigger discussion than I have time to get into. But know that there are some permanent changes that are starting to happen in our physiology. Sleep deprivation is actually a huge part of this as well that also goes understudied. The less amount of sleep that people have, it affects your REM sleep cycle and how long it takes you to get into what's called rapid eye movement. REM sleep, it's the dreaming state. And that's a good portion of what recharges your body. A lot of the rest of your sleep cycle is either getting you to that state or taking you back out of that state. And while you're in that process, if you don't get to as many REM cycles as you would normally, it usually takes a couple hours to get to there. You're only in REM state for a short amount of time, then you come out. Getting fewer of those means your body is getting different signals about when to metabolize things. We still don't understand as much about this as we want, but we've seen some strong correlations between people who have less total sleep and higher amounts of obesity, which also goes back to this. Longer hours, changes in work schedule, also longer commutes in some cases. Hopefully that problem may solve itself to some degree as telecommuting becomes a thing that is more permissible in offices, though that may create its own set of problems. Also, this issue we're going to talk about more, The evidence that antibiotic exposure, excessive antibiotic exposure for kids is a factor in obesity is still very thin. So I'm not convinced this is necessarily true, but it's an area of research that we've begun looking into because we actually end up exposing kids to a lot more antibiotics now than we used to, not because we're giving them more drugs, but because we pump our livestock full of antibiotics before they even have a disease as a preventative measure to increase the amount of yield we get out of our livestock. And that ends up getting transitioned into the meat and the stuff that we eat. So, separate issue. Last thing, there's a very strong link between increased levels of obesity and poverty. It's not one-to-one, but there's a huge correlation. Part of that is it's more expensive to eat healthy. And it's more time-consuming to eat healthy, and neither of those things are readily available to people living in poverty. Any other questions on this one? Yeah.
Just one thing I might add to that is the low-fat craze that's out for many years,
Yeah.
which caused people to gravitate towards foods that were, quote, low-fat, and in fact included
Yep.
way more sugar.
Oh, yeah.
And they've since, it's kind of controversial how that low-fat
Oh,
craze
yeah.
came to be, but
Yeah.
I think that has also contributed to.
I very much agree. The sugar industry is also another industry that has a lot of power. Going out to Florida and interview some people and you'll have a sense of how much power that industry's got. But they have done a great job of making fat the bad guy and sugar's just fine. We are reversing that, and we have been over the last 5 years or so. But yeah, there was a long time where that's low in fat, so I'm fine. Low fat ice cream, rock on. Maybe not. So low fat chocolate. But yeah, definitely an instance of misplacing where that particular blame goes. And part of that has to do with how we have our public sector act on these issues versus our private sector. To the extent to which we rely on the advertising trends of the private sector to educate us about our health, we are going to get the agendas of those private sector groups filtering through that education. And a lot of that is what happens because a lot of our education comes not from schools necessarily, but from advertising and marketing that we encounter. Next major issue for the developed world, and actually the developing world too, but we're going to focus more on the developed end of this, is mental health. This is something that's hitting on a couple different fronts at the same time. First off, kids. Now, we can talk about overprescription and overdiagnosis of some different disorders, and there's some legitimate arguments to be made there, and that things like attention deficit disorder are likely overdiagnosed. Autism is likely overdiagnosed. I don't think as far overdiagnosed as some folks suggest, because I think we were underdiagnosing to the point of not recognizing it previously, and the truth is probably somewhere in between the two. But that overdiagnosis is a thing, and it's something that, again, we can get into industry stuff and the propaganda that not propaganda, that's too harsh a term, but the marketing stuff that comes from industries that produce solutions to those potential problems and how that potentially encourages people to diagnose. That gets us into doctors and how they prescribe stuff, which is a whole nother talk. But those issues are a thing, but I want to focus less on those and more on a few other things that are having more immediate and severe effects. Anxiety is something, especially among high school and college students, has been skyrocketing in the last 15 years. It's something where some of my students, I just don't relate and connect. The amount of pressure that kids are facing now is very different from the kind of pressure that we faced before. Not that there wasn't always pressure of some kind, but the diagnoses of anxiety coming out of the college sphere, now that college is more competitive, and now that the future is a lot less certain for kids than it was a generation or so ago, those things are significantly increasing. The amount, in particular, in the last 5 years or so, the amount of anxiety that's existed in society in general and in high school kids has also begun to increase, partially competition for college being part of that, other factors too. We don't really know the full thing. Social media almost certainly plays a large part here in that you are constantly getting bombarded by what everybody else thinks, and that makes it very hard to set that aside and step back from those sorts of external opinions. It also makes everything seem much more consequential and like everybody is watching you all the time, which inherently is going to make you more anxious. There are a lot of things going into this one. Depression is also something that we've seen significantly rising, and in particular in younger kids. That leads to suicidal issues. And this is something that I think is one of the least appreciated trends in education and among youth. According to the CDC, the second leading cause of death for everyone between ages 15 and 34 is suicide. I've worked with suicide prevention hotlines. I've worked in mental health care and not indirectly. Like, I was not aware that it was anywhere near this high, and I don't think most people are either. It's a massive issue, and it's one that because of all the stigma around depression and mental health, we are not confronting anywhere near as effectively as we could or should. But even more than that, this I think is relevant. 8.5% of high school students, again, the CDC, attempted suicide in the last year. About 3% of students attempted suicide in a way that required medical attention afterwards. So this includes people who attempt in a way that is not, the attempt is not severe enough they have to go to the hospital or anything like that. But even if we narrow it down to just the smaller group that need immediate medical attention as a result, you're still looking at more than close to 1 in 20 students, which to me is sort of terrifying. And to me, it's also indicative that there's got to be something, there's got to be some explanation why there is a higher level of stress and pressure now than it was before. Maybe kids now are just wusses and they're weak and bad, if we want to accept that view. But I think that's kind of unlikely to explain anything like the sort of massive trends we see, suggesting there's something outside of that, even if we want to denigrate the younger generation as much as we can, which may be counterproductive to helping them. But even if we accept the far extreme view that says, this is just some sort of character flaw thing, even then, that doesn't seem to be enough to explain the numbers on the wide scale that they exist in. So again, I expect it likely goes somewhere in the opposite direction, and it's something that we likely need more attention and more care spent to. I don't know about you folks, did you have guidance counselors in school, generally speaking? I'm sorry to about half the guidance counselors I've had. Please ignore this part of the tape. Half of my guidance counselors were utterly useless and did absolutely nothing. About a third of them were actually sports coaches who needed to technically have a job at the school, so they made them a guidance counselor. A few of them were amazing and great, but they were the exception, not the rule. I do not know how guidance counselors function in schools today. I'll be honest, that's a blind spot for me. But it's definitely something that we have put a lot less emphasis into in terms of numbers of positions than the degree of problems seems to suggest perhaps we should. One other thing, there is a positive here, and that's that the trends in suicide among not the trans community, that's stayed pretty constant, but the LGBT, lesbian, gay, and bisexual community, that's actually been going down. It dropped significantly. They did a comparison actually of states that had legalized gay marriage side by side with states that hadn't. States that had legalized noticed about a 14% drop in suicide among among gay youth in high school level. And I think there's a fairly compelling causal argument to make there in that knowing that there is a future that you think is important for you that you now have access to that you did not have before, removing societal condemnation, which is otherwise etched into the foundations of the law of your state, those things probably matter. In a similar sort of way, transgendered youth are one of the highest groups in terms of suicide rates in the country. I expect and I hope that that's something that will change as more acceptance of those individuals rises. We'll see. But this particular subpopulation has been one that has always been incredibly vulnerable. Part of that is this is also a subpopulation that is very likely to be kicked out of their home by their parents. And living on the street is a great way to end up with all kinds of problems. And so now that that happens less for this subpopulation, but trans people still encounter that to a significant degree, things are changing a bit, hopefully. And again, for these folks, it's getting significantly better, which does show that there are larger societal changes that can be made that can directly affect this problem. So by identifying larger trends and larger social messages, we may be able to do more here than all the guidance counselors in the world stacked in a pyramid and acting like they're efficient. And again, some of them are great. But it may be possible to make changes here, like with some of the other issues we looked at in the developing world, in an indirect way, by thinking about social consequences and social changes to end up with effects on the mental health level. Yeah?
I've got a daughter who teaches high school.
Oh, all right.
In a, I won't mention the name, but
That's
a
right.
wealthy community
Yeah.
in Massachusetts. And she's been teaching for about 15 years now.
Mhm.
And I remember her first year, she called me up one day and she was totally freaked out because there was a suicide the day before.
Yeah.
And it was announced that day.
Mhm.
And this was her first year teaching.
Mhm.
And no one had ever prepared her for it. And she didn't
Yeah.
have a clue as to how to handle it.
Yeah. It's,
And I would
Yeah.
venture to say, 15 years later, she has still never been trained in any way. She's picked it
Yeah.
up. They probably average close to 1 suicide a year.
wow.
So she'll call me and tell me
Yeah.
what's going on. And she's figured it out over time. And
You have
deals
to,
with
but
it
yeah.
now a whole lot easier than But
And there's a parallel to this that, again, is a separate discussion, but I think is worth at least putting out there. Because of the way that we have engaged our mental health system and what coverage we do and do not provide for people in general, teachers are usually the front lines for almost all social and mental, and in some cases physical and abuse issues for almost everything. Like, we rely on our teachers to be social workers to a large degree because we don't generally provide that kind of social work support that everyone can access outside of their teacher. And I'm sorry, soapbox again. And we don't freaking pay them enough or train them enough for it. Okay, I'm done. I think there's an interesting argument that suggests that if those are the expectations that we have, there's definitely more that needs to go into preparing folks for that, and more that they should expect coming from us, both in terms of compensation and respect and interactions. So, definitely an issue. Other things worth noting here is there's a significant racial disparity on this issue. In particular, Native Americans, on average, are about twice as likely to commit suicide as members of any other ethnic group. Or, I'm sorry, as members of the Caucasian ethnic group. African Americans, specifically at a young age, between 5 and 12, are about twice as likely. That diminishes as they get into high school age, but at younger ages, it's significantly higher. There are a lot of potential explanations for this. I'm not going to go into all the details on them, but they're worth looking into. But again, time. Speaking of time and its advancing effects, senior citizens. Hi, folks. How are you? So there are some of the challenges that we're going to run into that this particular demographic group has more issues with. And so as our population ages, and as we've gotten better at extending life expectancy, we're encountering some of these issues with greater frequency. One of them is obviously dementia and Alzheimer's, which is where I mentioned that I would come back to Lyra very briefly here. Things like learning and retirement. Where is it? Oh, no, okay, never mind. I didn't have a bullet point for it. Things like learning and retirement, things that keep people's minds active, are incredibly important to staving off these. There's actually some really good research that indicates that continual use of those sorts of pathways prevents degeneration there, or at least slows it down. So things that can keep the elderly and our elderly communities more engaged are really helpful. It's another non-medical solution to a medical problem that can go a long way. Depression is also something that's been rising among the elderly. And there are, again, a bunch of different reasons for this, but I think that older generations tend to have a higher degree of stigma associated with mental health care than younger generations do. And I think this is something that just has to do with societal expectations at the times people were raised. But it's generally, people are statistically at least less willing to talk about or go to or engage in therapy at older generations compared to younger generations. So that may compound this problem a bit. Yeah.
Something that came across the other day, boomer generation, of which most
Yeah.
of us are part of, because of the individualism,
Hmm.
we were kind of culturally
Yeah.
led as we came up. That's causing many of us to live on our own versus in families or with other people. It's that loneliness
Yeah.
that's now being traced to having significant.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, it's a great point. And I think that's happening from two angles. One is the desire to be self-sufficient and live alone, which I think is important. And also there's the financial concerns where not a lot of families can actually support a multi-generational household, unlike what used to be more common. Both of those, I think, are relevant factors. Yeah.
the other thing you add to that is, I think today more than ever before, you get a lot more people who are moving away from,
Yeah.
you know, it used
Yep.
to be everybody you grew up and you had your cousins and
Yep.
everybody, your aunts and your uncles, all living within a quarter of a mile.
Yeah.
You know, now chances are you're in a state where you don't have anyone.
Yeah, my family's in Iowa, my sister's in Minnesota, other part of my family's in Idaho. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, definitely the case, and part of that is an economic trend in that
Well,
people have to
sometimes
move to where
it's
jobs are. So,
300 miles is a good distance, I found.
no, that can work. That can work well. So, high levels of stigma we talked about already. That an active lifestyle is something that's really particularly important here. Mentally active as much as, if not more important than physically active. One of the other things that I think goes along with this is we have a tendency when we have elder care facilities to sort of group people more based on age than based on what the particular challenges are. So folks who have mental difficulties may be grouped in the same area as people with physical difficulties when entirely different activities and engagement strategies are appropriate for those groups. And then we're not really able to engage either of them ideally, which creates its own, and they aren't able to engage one another ideally, which I remember my grandma being in a nursing home where she was, like her body was going, but her mind was right there till the end, and there were a lot of people who were in her facility for whom that was not the case. So there were not a lot of people she could socially interact with, and that created its own set of problems. So. Let me jump to the next issue then, because yeah, I'm eating through time like nobody's business. Next issue is the opioid epidemic. You can't talk about healthcare in the developed world without talking about this. So first, let's take a look at the trends, where we are now and how we got there. So 1999 forward. Purple line here is the rise in prescription opioid overdose deaths. So these are things like OxyContin, things like that. So you can see those went up for a bit. Then around 2010, they sort of leveled off. They're tilting back up now, but we kind of got a handle on that a little bit. Rise in heroin overdose deaths, largely static, and then around about 2010, they start to jump up as well. They skyrocket in the last few years. And here is by far the biggest jump. Synthetic opioid overdose deaths, incredibly significant spike toward the end, in particular right around here. Fentanyl has been around for quite a while, but it entered more widespread distribution around these times. It started being prescribed more, and that's a part of the cause. So, on average, about 115 Americans die every day from an opioid overdose. I do think it is interesting that we talk about the opioid epidemic differently than we talked about the crack or cocaine epidemic, largely because the demographics of the people affected by it are different. I think that is a social comment that is worth noting, and I've noted it. We can now set it aside and keep going. But it's worth thinking about the language and the perspective we take on what are fundamentally very similar problems experienced by different people and different groups of people more commonly. Second, so when we talk about traditional opioids, that's this sort of area. We're talking things like morphine, stuff that's derived from the opium poppy. So that's stuff that's pretty close to the original thing, concentrated or refined or manipulated a little bit, but coming from the original plant. Heroin, again, I expect y'all have a vague familiarity, derived from the opium poppy, generally less refined, a lot less consistent. You don't really know what you're getting, which is part of what happens with illegal drugs. And that poses a portion of the problem, because it's very hard to assess, if you're a purchaser of it, the level of purity of the drug, the level of concentration of the drug, which makes overdoses more likely. The massive euphoric state it tends to give people is also something that drops off with further injections or further exposure to it. And so you get the chasing the dragon phenomenon, where people are trying to get back to whatever that first level of exposure is, but no further exposure with the drug will ever mimic that first level. It'll usually be the highest level of euphoria that they will find, which creates a downward spiral as people take more and more of it to try to get to that point and don't succeed, and then eventually overdose and die. Synthetic opioids, this is the new big deal. These are things that are created in a lab, largely using the same chemical structure as opium, but not directly derived from an existing plant or chemical. They're all synthesized. And part of what makes this really dicey is synthetic opioids are 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. I don't know if any of you all have ever had surgery and had morphine as a result. I did once, and whoa. But holy crap. What these are designed for is what's called breakthrough pain. So if someone is having cancer treatment and they are in a chronic, severe amount of pain, they will be on likely on other opioid painkillers. But if something happens where there's some sort of organ failure, there's a new surgery on top of what they just had that causes that pain level to spike, very briefly, things like synthetic opioids like fentanyl would be used to counteract that, with the idea that it would be backed off of very quickly and would only be used to deal with those spikes. There are a number of things that have made that not the case. Part of that deals with the rate at which these things are prescribed, which we'll go into more depth on in just a second, and the frequency with which that happens. Part of that has to deal with how these were marketed and how these were explained to doctors. A big issue that I expect that the pharmaceutical industry is going to have the same sort of come to Jesus moment that the tobacco industry had back in the day, when for years it was secondhand cigarettes aren't bad for you, there's no conclusive proof, secondhand smoke doesn't exist, it's all in your head, it's just the hippies. And then eventually it turns out, yeah, they totally had the evidence that it did that, and they were making a point of making sure people didn't know about it. We might be able to make a similar argument about oil companies and climate change. That's a little sketchier connection. But here, pharmaceutical companies marketed opioids to doctors, synthetic opioids in particular, and claimed that they did not have significant addictive capabilities. We've got memos going to sales executives saying that these are the talking points, when that was known to very clearly not be the case. So doctors would then prescribe them, and people would end up getting addicted, and then we end up with a whole huge set of problems. Part of what makes those particularly bad is that these, as the name suggests, can be synthesized. So a large number of the fentanyl overdoses that happen now, especially in the last year or two, are less from overprescription, we're starting to get a handle on that, and more from synthetic fentanyl that's being manufactured and sold on the black market. Because now that we've created the need, people have stepped in to provide the supply. And part of what becomes a problem with those is a lot of those are cut with cocaine or heroin or other substances in order to make them more desirable, in order to stimulate the high that people are looking for. And again, because it's unregulated, you don't know exactly what is in it or how much. And again, the concentration here is freaking insane. So that's kind of where we're at there. Oh yeah, that's this. Illicit production of fentanyl is continuing to rise. We don't really have a good handle on how to solve that problem yet. We don't seem to be tracking down and trying to track down fentanyl labs the same way we've tracked down meth labs in the past. I don't entirely know why. That's outside of my area of expertise, but maybe that's a thing that's coming in the future. Other issue with the opioid epidemic, me talk good, is what it is that we can do in response. And there are a number of different responses that I just want to give a quick overview to. If we have time at the end, I'm happy to go back and do Q&A on any of these and debate or discuss which ones we think might be better or worse. So one option is naloxone. I'm saying that wrong. Naloxone. Yeah, naloxone, did I say that right? Yeah. Okay. Drugs, name production. Yeah. But naloxone is a chemical that can reverse an overdose. If someone is ODing and you get to them and you give them this, it can roll back the overdose. It's not guaranteed, and especially with something like fentanyl that is so potent, you oftentimes have to administer multiple applications of this in order to have the effect you need, which is an education thing in terms of the people doing it they need to be aware of. But it's one option. There are a couple things that have been debated over recently. One is whether we should supply all EMTs with this. There are a lot of folks who are like, yes, you get called to deal with an overdose death, you should be able to deal with the overdose before the person dies. There are people on the other hand who would argue that sure, the first time, fine, but if you OD on something and this is the third time EMS has come to visit you, they should not resuscitate you. You had your chances at life, you passed. Or at least they shouldn't use this component to do it. There is a debate to be had there about to what degree it is the government's responsibility or the government's job to protect people from themselves, and to what degree we should reallocate public resources in different ways. But that is a solution that's been proposed and has had some controversy on both ends of it. Second, the CDC has actually suggested distributing this chemical to families of people who know that they have someone who's had addiction problems there and educating them on how to use it. So if that person overdoses, they've got it on hand, because time is a really important factor here. If it goes long enough, nothing's going to help. So being able to have it on hand and distribute it quickly, that's an issue. That makes a difference. On the flip side, there are people who are concerned that this may create a more permissive environment where people are more willing to use the drug rather than trying to kick the habit because they think they'll be protected. Yeah?
How expensive is naloxone?
Naloxone? I actually honestly don't know.
There's actually a thing on 60 Minutes a couple weeks ago.
What'd they say?
Into all that.
Oh, well, there you go. You're like 2.5 steps ahead of me.
They crank up the price, and then the owner of the company had this whole do-good thing where they reduced the price. It's a very complicated thing.
We're going to get to pharmaceutical pricing in just a bit, because that's an issue here and other places too. Interestingly enough, the same companies that made things like fentanyl, OxyContin, etc., Gesundheit, are now in the process of patenting a drug that is designed to help cure or treat opioid addiction. So they will have made all the money off of creating them and selling them, and now they will make a lot more money off of creating and selling the cure to the problem they created. Capitalism.
Maybe the fossil fuel companies can do that with climate change.
That could be a fun discussion to have. Second, potential option, medication-assisted therapy. And this is also something where there's some level of controversy, but that varies depending on where you are. Things like methadone clinics, buprenorphine clinics. The idea is both of these two are opioid derivatives, but they don't have the same kinds of dangers associated with them. They mitigate the symptoms. So they mitigate withdrawal symptoms. So if you're going through withdrawal from heroin, for example, methadone is a thing that you can take that will help to mitigate those withdrawal symptoms until you can get yourself, at least in theory, to stop using the drug at all. For some people, it ends up becoming a maintenance thing, and it's something that for the rest of their life they have to accept that they're going to deal with. For a lot of folks, though, it's sort of a bridge option in moving toward getting off of stuff. And part of the issue is, for a lot of these drugs, the withdrawal symptoms are terrible. Like, your body tries to shut down, and it's utterly agonizing. So having these kinds of solutions available to bridge that gap, for a lot of people, and here I don't have direct experience, so I'm relating what we've heard study-wise, for a lot of folks, what draws them back to the drug, especially people who didn't start off on heroin but started off on a prescription drug, what draws them back is not necessarily the search for the high, though for some that's definitely it. It's trying to stave off the withdrawal symptoms, because the only way that you end the withdrawal symptoms is to give your body another injection or another hit of what it is you took in the first place. And these can be used to mitigate that. There are folks who argue that this just exacerbates the problem and that it still has people dependent on a drug of some kind, and that that's something that we should not encourage. People should use willpower to quit, and if they can't do that, that's a problem. These therapies, I'd say, are largely accepted by the medical community universally embraces their effectiveness. They are significantly more effective than things like Narconon or 12-step programs that do not incorporate them. But there are still people who raise ethical arguments about what is or is not acceptable and what we should or should not encourage and the effect that these things might have. Well, like I said, some controversy. Whether the government supports these programs will vary based on your city and your state. Some places the government has refused to do so, other places they support it. The last, one of the other things we could potentially consider as a way to deal with this problem is stronger restrictions on synthetic opioids. There are instances where they are useful, especially for people with chronic pain that then does that kind of flare-up issue. So for breakthrough pain, they absolutely have a purpose. But that purpose may be so infrequent that a higher level of control should be exercised over when and how they're prescribed, or we may consider them not worth the dangers that they pose. I think there are potential problems on either side of that, but that's another way to potentially deal with this problem, is to in some way limit the supply. On the flip side, though, the fact now that it's out there and there's synthetics being produced for it, it's a little harder to crack down entirely. But at the very least, we can, in theory, prevent fewer new people from being exposed to it and thus becoming addicted. Any other questions on? Yeah, go ahead.
I just have 2 points to explain
Please.
a little bit to show how complex things
Oh, yeah.
I have one friend who's had degenerative back disease for 20 plus years.
Yeah.
Went through various treatments and stuff and was on opioids, the
Yeah.
only thing that would work for him.
Yeah.
When we legalized marijuana, because of the lack of any studies to show what would be best for it, he had to experiment with different things.
Sure.
And he found 5% THC and 10% of CBD, the two major components
Yeah.
in a pill form, worked perfectly for him. So
Awesome.
he was able to get off the opioids.
That's great.
Because we legalized medical marijuana, right?
More options,
The other
good.
point is some of our attempts to try to restrict prescriptions. I know
Mhm.
another individual, okay? She has multiple pain-producing diseases
Oof.
that she's dealing
Yeah,
with.
it's rough.
The only thing that can do the breakthrough of the pain are the opioids.
Yeah.
And there's times when things flare up with her body, she can't get enough prescriptions because it's limited how much she can have in a month.
Yep.
Right? So there's someone who's in need, but our attempt to control an individual's use is now impinging and causing.
Exactly. And that's a lot of the problem with this is there's the balancing act to try to do. We're likely to cause, if we're too permissive, we cause a lot of harm. If we're too impermissive, we cause a lot of harm. And even in the middle, we're probably causing some harm. So trying to figure out how we balance those most effectively, very, very difficult question, and one that we're going to be asking for a while. Go ahead, sir.
Is this unique to the US? Do other developed countries have this opioid?
Not to the same degree. And part of that is, that's complicated, more complicated than I have time for, sadly. I hate to keep giving that answer. But part of it is the way our pharmaceutical industry works here and the way that direct marketing of pharmaceutical representatives to doctors in the United States is something that is not allowed pretty much anywhere else in the industrialized world. Also, directly advertising medication to patients is something that is not allowed in most of the world. So if you want to find out, if you're a doctor and you want to find out what prescriptions you should use, there are medical conferences to go to, journals to read, that kind of stuff that will tell you. There's not a pharmaceutical rep who will show up, buy lunch for the whole office, and explain that they will keep coming back, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, if you prescribe enough of this.
They don't do that.
Nah, that's fair. I've overstated that one.
20 years ago. You don't see a drug rep in a doctor's office buying lunch anymore. They rarely.
That I actually think they can't do one-on-one stuff, but they can do things to the office in general, as I understand.
What you will find are teaching situations where they can teach stuff, but they don't do what was done 20 and 40 years ago.
It looks like you may have a thought on. One sec, I'd like to hear other people's thoughts on this one too, because I may be wrong on this, and I'm totally willing to admit that, and I would like to hear other thoughts. Yeah.
2 comments. First, 6 weeks ago, I was at the doctor's office and they walked this bimbo who was selling drugs to the doctor. I mean, she was a drug dealer, but I knew who she was. So it's still going on. Secondly, I wanted to mention, and it's probably common to most people here, I had a hernia operation and the doctor prescribed 30 OxyContin. And it was like, Doc, I don't want any OxyContin, just something mild.
Tylenol's good, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. And part of the concern there is if you're a doctor, you don't want to underprescribe what someone needs because you don't want to leave them in pain, but I don't think there's been enough appreciation for the dangers of overprescription. And I think that's something that we're starting to pull back on now. At the end of the session, remind me, because I'd like to actually do a little bit of research to see, because I may be outdated on that. I know there are more restrictions now than we used to have, but those restrictions are voluntary restrictions by and large. They're not laws that prevent it from happening. They're industries that have decided to stop doing it because the PR they got for it was bad, which is a legitimate reason to change things. But let me check into that, because you may be right on that, and I want to acknowledge that possibility there and then there. Yes, please, ma'am.
So, feeling really naive about this.
Mhm.
So, you mentioned earlier in this subject about kind of socioeconomic
Yeah.
group that this is impacting, so
Yeah.
there's a different response to it.
Racial group is honestly a huge part of it as well. The war on drugs was very much crafted, and here you can get back to statements by Lee Atwater, statements by Nixon himself. The war on drugs is largely crafted as a way to, it was a new iteration of racialized policy. But that again, a whole separate discussion, and there are people who will disagree with that assessment with legitimate reasons. But,
I'm not understanding about the sort of, sorry,
no worries, go ahead and get it.
the epidemic here,
Mhm.
the overdoses, is my husband just had gallbladder surgery.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
he
that
was-
sucks.
He
Yeah.
was prescribed 30 oxycodone as well. We're like, really? So let's pretend for a minute that he took them
Yep.
and it helped the pain, and suddenly he's addicted.
Yep.
What happens from there? I mean, how does he get into a crisis place? Does he go back to the doctor and the doctor is prescribing more? Or is he suddenly
Yeah.
finding a way to get it on the black market? Like, how
Yeah.
is this?
One of two ways. Usually, so people can go back to the doctor and request more. Doctors now, we are trying to train them to identify when someone is fishing for drugs as opposed to needing it. ER doctors get a lot of training on that because a lot of people will come into the ER as a way to try to get access to those kinds of drugs. So that's one option. If that fails, then he tries to find somebody who knows somebody who has it and get it that way. Or maybe he has a friend who also got prescribed 30 oxycodone, so he asks his friend, if you don't need all that, do you mind if I have some? And then it continues and continues. Ideally, in order to beat that, he either goes to his doctor and says, yeah, I got a problem, help me out. And the doctor puts him in touch with a treatment network of some kind, or a detox center or something along those lines, or calls a helpline himself, or his family members do.
So the war on drugs was heroin, cocaine, the meth labs, right? So that was sort of
Yeah.
a black market. We have like this new black market now.
Well,
Is it opioid?
To a large degree. So part of the issue is that a lot of these drugs, like opioids, have a legitimate medical purpose to them in a way that cocaine kind of did, but not really. And heroin, as to the degree to which it is a derivative of morphine, which does have a legitimate medical usage, maybe kind of, but a lot of the design of the war on drugs was more about imprisoning people who, I'm drifting further into advocacy here, so I want to try to pull myself back a little bit.
I'm just
I think it is.
How do people overdose? Where are they getting it?
Oh, they're finding people who will sell it to them. And I actually do not know the process of best locating a drug dealer because I haven't tried. But I expect it probably involves Craigslist or other internet stuff as a way to do it, or knowing people who know people.
Okay, so there's this whole different level group of people who are now getting into this,
Yeah.
finding ways to get the drug because
Yep.
they're addicted.
You could ask the same thing about how do people get cocaine. Like, they find a person who knows a person who knows a person, and they get it. So it's the same kind of a process, or meth, which is another drug that can be synthesized and created in the same way that synthetic opioids can. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Can you comment on whether this is true or not?
Mhm.
I think in the 80s, the drug industry was not as profitable. I mean, I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
it wasn't.
You are correct.
And then they deregulated it and, changed the whole profit motive, I guess. And,
That was a part. Excuse me. That was a part of it. There were other parts as well for why the pharmaceutical industry has become as profitable as it is. Partly, it's able, like the kinds of drugs that we have been able to create are drugs that are. So the things that make you a ton of money in the pharmaceutical industry. We'll talk. Actually, let me hold this because that is actually I think where we're going right after this. Let me get into that there. But it's a very legit observation, just about 3 minutes early. Any other comments on this one? We good? All right, cool. So next, let's talk prescription drug costs. So this is as of 2013. Things have changed a little bit since then in that drug prices for the US On average, the difference is pretty much the same, but this is the spending per capita in terms of US dollars on prescription drugs. This is the average for the top 31 developed countries in the world is right here. This is the US. And there are a bunch of things that have affected that. We'll get to the next chart here. Oh yeah, well, here we go. So the US is an outlier on these. We pay significantly more than other countries. There are a bunch of reasons for that. Some are very legitimate and make a lot of sense. Others are a little sketchier. One of the reasons is Medicaid is prohibited by law from negotiating with drug companies for lower prices. This is part of Medicare Part D. It was one of George W. Bush's senior things. It allowed senior citizens on Medicare to have access to prescription drugs and have that covered, which is a great idea, really important. Go. But one of the limitations and the caveats that got put in there in the negotiation process was Medicare under no circumstances will negotiate with the pharmaceutical industry for lower prices.
That's just because they were paid off.
It is hard to come up with a compelling reason other than that, from my perspective. Maybe I'm missing one. So the way it works is in almost every other developed country, whatever their healthcare agency is, they go to the drug maker and they say, all right, so this is the drug you want to sell. Cool, we will pay you this much for it. If you don't want to sell it to us, that's cool, we won't cover it, we'll find a competitor, or you will lose out on the single largest market in this nation. It's your choice. You either give us a price that we want, or you lose this market. In almost all instances, drug makers would rather sell their drug and make slightly less money on it than not sell it. So in most of these other countries, that is one thing that decreases the price. There are other factors too, which we'll get to in a sec, but Medicare not being able to negotiate prices, that is a significant factor because Medicare is the single largest buyer in the United States. Second, we generally have higher copays in the US for prescription drugs than do other nations. We also very rarely have monthly or annual caps, unlike other nations. So copays for prescriptions in Norway, for example, it's generally a $50 copay on every prescription, but they have a monthly cap of $290. Actually, is that a monthly or an annual? I have to double check on that. But either way, the initial copay is higher, but they cap it out after a certain rate, so you will never have to pay more than that. Because the US, instead of having any kind of centralized healthcare system, which has its own host of problems, but because we don't have that system, those tools are not available to us in the same way. You take whatever your insurance company will give you, and since you usually get your insurance through your work, which doesn't give you a ton of choices there, you're also a little bit locked in. Third, insurance operates as a middleman in the US, so do what are called PBMs, pharmacy benefit manufacturers, or pharmacy benefit managers. There are, I think, 4 or 5 of these companies in the entirety of the US. So every pharmacy that gets its drugs gets them from a PBM. PBMs are the ones that buy them from the companies that make them. So oftentimes PBMs will go to a company and say, all right, they'll do the sort of thing we were just talking about Medicare not being able to do. We buy the drugs that a fifth of the American population uses. If you want to sell those to us, this is the price you're going to sell them at. And so they then get them at a discount. The catch is then when insurance companies cover them, the percentage that insurance companies will usually charge you is based on what's called the list price of the drug. That is the total price, not based on the cheaper price the PBM got, which is actually what's being paid for. So that's another reason why we, as individuals, tend to pay a lot more. So drug companies get a decent chunk of the blame. Insurance companies deserve their share of the blame there too. And PBMs operating in the middle is another thing that changes that. Now, part of that is the scale of our market. There is a larger market in the US than Britain or France or anything like that. So it is not necessarily, like the fact that they are able to do something doesn't mean it could necessarily scale up to our level without there being other administrative problems. So I don't want this to be a single payer solves all problems thing, because it might solve some, but this is one it may not get around as much as we'd like. The pharma bro effect. Oh, God. If you ever want to think of an image, I should have put a picture of him up here, of the smarmiest guy you have ever seen. Like the term smarmy in the dictionary should have this guy next to it. Martin Shkreli. He most hated man in America was the title that got applied to him. So here's what he did, and what he did is not unique to him. But he set up a company. His company bought Daraprim, which is a drug they give to cancer and AIDS patients. And his company bought the rights to this drug, or bought this drug from another company that had been manufacturing it. The drug has been out there for 50 years. His company buys it. And then he increases the price 5,600%. That's not a typo. 5,600%, from $14 a pill to $750 a pill, without changing anything about it. But because his company is the only one that makes it, it's generic at this point. There's no patent monopoly, but nobody else has the infrastructure set up to produce it, and it's going to take them a year or two to build all the factories and figure out all the formulas and do that. for at least the next 2 years until someone decides to try to undercut him, all of those people now have to pay this much for their drug, and there has been no change. EpiPen, if you followed any of what happened with them, exact same sort of thing. This happens to about 20% of all generic drugs in America. They experience massive price hikes without any change in content or manufacturing or details to the drug. Insulin's having similar sorts of problems now. They experience a massive price hike, and there is absolutely nothing we can do about it legally. Shkreli ended up going to jail, but not for this. This is totally legal. He went to jail because he deceived his investors about something, which lying to people with money, that's a problem. This, whole different deal. That's a little tongue-in-cheek, but not by much. So this problem is one that is unique to the United States among developed nations, because almost every other developed nation has a price cap system of some kind. Now, there are problems, admittedly, with trying to set all of the prices for every drug. A command economy, which is what your old school socialism setups tried to do, that didn't work so well in the Soviet Union, and I don't think anybody's advocating for that. But having some kind of limitation or something that prevents this sort of exorbitant scenario from happening is something that most other nations have, and we do not. Yeah?
How does that work with what you're saying, with like some of these multinational companies like Glaxo?
Yeah. Oh, they'll sell Daraprim still for $14 a pill in England, but $750 here.
So if you want, so you can get a pill, you're better off taking a trip to England?
Yeah, except transporting a certain amount of pharmaceuticals across country lines potentially violates customs. You also can't get drugs shipped from one country to another. That's also illegal. So don't worry, they thought of that. It's definitely true, right? The quality standards, I might be a little more skeptical getting drugs from Burundi than I would be getting drugs from Canada, because I expect the regulatory scheme in Canada is I know it's pretty comparable to the FDA, not identical, and there's, like the US, the FDA is probably the most rigorous of any oversight organization in the world, so that's one of the other things that slows things down here a bit. There are ways we might be able to cut that back, but that's one of the issues involved. The last thing I would note on the profit and the drug development innovation side is some of the arguments that get made there as well. The profitability of the pharmaceutical industry, it all varies year by year. Back in 2016, they were making on average about 13% profit. Now I think it's closer to about 11%, because that was sort of a high year for them because a couple new big things came out. They make around 11 to 12% profit. If you're in the auto sales industry, you make about 6% profit. The restaurant industry makes about 3% profit. So the argument that I think some folks would make is it's true they need to get a large return in order for it to be worthwhile, but large doesn't mean super huge, mega large. They could get half the return they're getting now and probably still justify it, arguably. Other people will say on the flip side, well, no, because then some of the investors will go dump their money into software instead, where they have a bigger hope of return. And we want the biggest possible return to be people who are pouring money into a cure for cancer, not some Snapchat 2.0. So there's an argument for incentivizing it here. The third potential aspect of this that's important is there are ways to research drugs other than the private sector. And that's kind of gets left out of the discussion here. The NIH, the National Institute of Health, almost every major drug that is developed in the United States pulls research that the NIH has already done that was publicly funded. We spend $30 billion a year on the NIH doing basic medical research, which then gets used by companies to do the finishing end of it and create a drug. So it is definitely possible for the federal government, if we chose, to be the agent that supplied the R&D capital to create new drugs. But that's not a priority we've decided to invest in, and so that's not the way that we do it now.
But then you're just paying in taxes.
Correct. But there it becomes a question.
Have a high degree of activity.
Well, hang on one sec. In terms of paying it in taxes, though, that isn't necessarily the case. Some of it would be, but if it's a difference between just paying the straight R&D cost in taxes versus paying the multiplied part, because you don't need to get any positive return if the government's doing it. They don't need to make a profit, because by definition they are non-profit. They just need to produce a product and cover cost. So. Agreed. If we had more time, this is actually the high school debate topic for this month, is about putting price caps on the pharmaceutical industry. So I've been inundated in this one. Forgive me for kind of going a little long on it. So this is one of the other things I wanted to get to. There are implications to the way our system is set up now. In addition to the prices just being sort of annoying, there are some secondary parts. This is looking at percentage of adults who did not fill prescriptions or skipped doses in prescriptions because of the cost. This is again going back to 2013. It takes a couple years to get reliable data each time. The United States, you may notice a slight difference between some of the other countries in terms of percentages.
So we're the only ones without a national health care system, are we not?
Yeah. one might contend that that makes a difference. So high price increases end up leading to decreased health outcomes. The Obamacare and the ACA, this number's actually gone down. It's around 14% now instead of 21%. So the ACA actually did a lot there because it expanded the number of people who had insurance, and insurance makes it more likely you can afford your prescriptions. So it still creates problems, and it still isn't enough in some cases, but it makes it more likely. So now about 14 in 100 Americans cannot afford it. So lower than it was, but still higher than some people would think is ideal. Because ideal would probably be like there. Yeah, so now 14% of people aren't. 34% of the uninsured in America are prescribed drugs for a disease or a condition that they have and are not able to afford that drug, or have to skip doses of it in order to do that. So that's where we are in terms of the effects that it has. Let's talk real quick about potential responses, some of which we've already touched on. First, expand Medicaid in particular, or expand the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. This is something that has been being rolled back in bits and pieces, though it hasn't been entirely undone. In particular, the Affordable Care Act largely, and we can do a whole thing on this too, the Affordable Care Act largely made insurance more available to people by providing government subsidies. So if you were too poor to afford insurance, the government would help you do it, was the idea. How exactly that formula works, who is and isn't included, legitimate tweaks and changes need to get made there probably. But at least it expanded that to some degree. The second thing that it did that was relevant is it told insurance companies there's some limits on what counts as actual insurance. You can't sell people a plan that has a $10,000 deductible and $2 billion copays and claim you've given them insurance. You've got to meet these basic requirements, you have to cover these basic conditions, and you can't have prices high, prices need to fall in this range. These are the services you got to cover if you want to be considered legitimate insurance. That has largely been rolled back by the Trump administration and by individuals in Congress. So that's part of why I expect that number of people unable to afford their prescription to tick back up in the next 2 years from where it had dropped before. But that's one thing that we can do is reverse the reversal and go back to where we had been there, and or expand Medicaid. So Medicare is for seniors and disabled folk by and large. Medicaid is for the poor. A lot of Medicaid is administered on a state-by-state basis, so the government will provide funding to states. And this is actually what the ACA had done, is it told states, all right, look, we want you to offer Medicaid to more people. So not just the super poor, but the pretty poor as well. They should also get access to it. So if you expand upward the number of people that you allow into Medicaid, we, the government, will foot a part of that bill for you for like the first 8 or 10 years. And then we will gradually taper that off. There were some states who accepted that. There were some states who didn't. The states that didn't, it was largely a political calculus decision, though there are other things that may have gone into it too. The states that did expand Medicaid dramatically increased the access to health care for poor people. States that did not. So further expansion there and finding ways to fund that would be relevant. Allowing Medicare to negotiate, like the VA does, as we mentioned, would be another way that we could potentially change these dynamics. Implementing price controls or price caps in some way, saying that you cannot sell X drug for more than X amount, like they do in many countries, developed countries in the world. Another way to potentially get there, it has the side effect of less profits flowing to the pharmaceutical industry, which does run the risk of there being less innovation and less creation of new drugs. So part of what needs to get weighed here is the creation of new drugs that some folks can afford and others may not be able to, versus access to existing drugs that people may need. And how we weigh those is a worthwhile discussion. Third, allowing drug reimportation, as we talked about. So what happens in a lot of instances, I think this is particularly hilarious, well, in a sad sort of way. 75% of all pharmaceuticals are actually manufactured here in the United States. We then ship them to other countries. What this would say is, we'll do that, we'll make them, we'll ship them to Canada, and then we will permit Canada to ship them back to us. Because the price gets set in Canada then. As soon as the drug gets to the distributor, that's when the price is set, not the wholesale price that comes from the producer. So, yay. We can also accelerate FDA approval. This is something that I think is significant. The FDA is pretty slow at what it does. Part of this is we've cut back their bureaucracy a fair amount, and we've cut back the people and the funding we give to them, which means they're not as quick. Part of it is they have higher standards than some other places do. In some cases, those standards may be slightly excessive, and they may be slowing down innovation in a reasonable sort of way. So we can probably tinker with that, maybe pull those back a little bit to let drugs get through faster, because a lot of the issue is, for most companies, the patent, so you get 20 years of exclusivity on your drug, right? You make a drug, 20 years, you're the only person who can do it. But that 20 years starts when you first have put together the discovery, not once all the testing and the FDA approval is done. So FDA approval will take 5 to 7 to 8 years sometimes. So you're losing almost half of your exclusivity time period then. If we could cut that wait period down by a couple years, now if instead of trying to make all of the money I sunk into the drug back in 13 years, I've got 16 years to make that money back, I can set the price lower and still get the same return. So that may be another way to potentially incentivize a decreased price. Though that doesn't solve the pharma bro scenario, and to be fair, most of these, the reimportation and price controls would. The others probably would not. Cut patent monopoly times. We could give people less than 20 years, which gets generic drugs created sooner, which also, generic drugs generally pull the price down significantly, because if all I'm doing is taking everything you did, copying it, and doing it myself, I don't have to spend the billions in research and development you did, so I can sell my stuff a lot cheaper and still make a profit. So then, as soon as that starts happening, the name brand company also has to lower their price or no one's going to buy their stuff, they'll all just buy mine. Yeah?
There's no royalty involved.
Nope. Nope. Generics, once it enters the public domain and the patent evaporates.
So if you cut the patent time, the patent time, you would probably want to add some kind of a
You could.
Well, otherwise, it doesn't make sense, as you said.
Assuming they need the amount of profit they need now. If you make the assumption that the amount of profit they have now is excessive, then you probably don't mind cutting that down a bit. And that's a worthwhile internal debate to have, because pharmaceutical companies will not disclose the list price of their drugs by and large, nor will they disclose the amount that they allocate to R&D. Some of the internal investigations that have been done by the government, most pharmaceutical companies actually spend more on marketing than they do on R&D, though that's reasonable because you need to sell your product to make money.
By the way, we are the only industrialized country that allows marketing
I know.
of pharmaceuticals.
Yep.
One quick thing in terms
Yeah.
of generics.
Please.
Generics, in terms of being able to catch a royalty,
Yeah.
generics are not necessarily chemically exact duplicates of what the original discovery was.
Mhm.
They can be close,
Yeah.
be as effective or more or less,
Mhm.
but it would be hard to say how close it is chemically to where you could get a royalty.
Yeah. In a lot of cases, there are also isomers, so it's where you basically have the same chemical, but you flipped it around. It gets into complicated chemistry stuff. But it often does the same thing, but sometimes not quite. So yeah, there are, again, a lot, you're right, there's a lot more depth there than we have time for, because I know I'm already over time. Danny, are you going to tell me to shut up?
No, you can keep going until 3.
Okay, cool. That actually will give us enough time. So, single payer, Medicare for all would also do a lot to change this, because then we don't have the pharmacy benefit managers that you need to go through. We've cut out some of the middlemen. We've also, assuming this gets coupled with this, we have done in the same thing here that most European countries have done, which is told pharmaceutical companies, if you want to sell your drug to one of the single biggest markets in the world, you better give us a price that doesn't suck. So that potentially has some potential to it as well. So that's the pharmaceutical drug thing. Yeah, we'll talk about these. So 2 major issues I want to get to briefly on the global level. So the stuff we just covered are mostly issues in the developed world. On the global level, superbugs is not just the new hot Marvel movie this year. It's also something particularly important. Drug-resistant bacteria is what we're talking about here. So if you look here at the rate at which new antibiotics are being created, you may notice a slightly disturbing trend. The arrow goes that way, not that way. So over time, fewer and fewer new antibiotics are being made, both in the US and anywhere are being created. And that's leading to a couple things. First, antibiotic bacteria are rising. There are more and more of them around. Basic idea is this. I got a petri dish full of a bunch of different bacteria, right? I throw an antibiotic at that. By sheer random chance, a few of those bacteria are going to have a mutation that makes them resistant to it. When I soak it in an antibiotic, I kill off everything except those few bacteria that are resistant. And then they multiply. And now what I have are all those bacteria who are resistant. Now it needs to happen on a really, really large scale over a long time for that new population to supplant the old one, but that's what's been happening. So we've got a couple different causes of what are getting us here. First, overprescription of antibiotics is part of it. Like penicillin was a wonder drug, and we used it to pretty much fight everything, and now we're getting things that are like, whatever penicillin, I learned how to beat you years ago, and it doesn't do any good there. So some issues with overprescription, but a bigger thing, second thing, patients not finishing the full prescription. Anytime a doctor gives you a thing and says, take all of them, there are health reasons, but there are also broader reasons, which is, in a lot of cases, the stuff I'm taking is killing or weakening a lot of the bacteria, and at a high enough dose, it may even kill off the resistant bacteria. But if we don't get enough of it to kill off the resistant ones, we leave those resistant ones alive, and they make lots of little baby bacteria, and then they come back and kill you, which is bad. So that's a secondary cause. And if you remember back from before, not high prescription costs are actually causing people to not take their full prescription sometime, so we may be creating and exacerbating this problem, again, in a way that they link. Second, this I think is highly underlooked at. Single biggest factor in antibiotic resistance is their use in livestock. The way that this is generally done is, and this is about 80% of the antibiotic resistance that we are encountering gets traced back to here. What will happen is in the feed and in the water that we give to livestock, we dump a bunch of antibiotics in there just by default. And the idea is that way I don't have to go through and see which chickens are sick and which ones aren't. I make sure they've all got antibiotics in their system, so whatever bacteria they encounter, they're already good to deal with. Problem is that also means that you are killing off everything that all those antibiotics can kill off and leaving just the resistant ones all the time, which means that process of shifting them over to just the drug-resistant superbugs happens a lot faster. So unless we change our agricultural practices, there is very little likelihood that we will solve this problem. Yeah?
Plus, aren't we eating the antibiotics? So,
Yep.
so we're constantly feeding ourselves with antibiotics,
Yep.
which is...
In some cases, the effectiveness is gone by the time it gets to us, but yeah, that's also a part of it, absolutely. This is the other big thing. No brand new antibiotic has been developed in 25 years. Most of these are variants on existing antibiotics. So you take one that exists and you tweak something about it. But no brand new thing has happened anytime recently, and there's a big reason for that. They're not profitable. Think about it this way. If you're a drug company, the kind of drug you want, your miracle drug, is something that someone has to take every day for the rest of their life. Because then they have to buy it from you every day for the rest of their life. A drug that has high intensity, short duration, not profitable. Like, take 3 of these and you're good. Game over. You don't have to sell anymore, so you make very little money on that. Unless you charge outrageously high prices, which I suppose you can do, but that means they won't be in wide circulation. So antibiotics, they are short-term curative drugs. They actually solve a problem instead of long-term therapeutic drugs that just mitigate symptoms and make a condition more bearable. Those are the drugs that the industry largely wants to develop, because if they cure the problem, you can't keep selling people a solution to it because it's already done. So because the private industry-based development system, antibiotic development largely has ended across the world. The other thing that limits this is what's called the non-inferiority requirement. So when I go to present a drug to the FDA, there's a bunch of stuff I got to show them. But one of the things I have to show is that it does something useful, and if whatever it does, there's another drug out there that already does that thing, I got to show that my drug is at least as good as what's already out there. That make sense? Otherwise, people are going to say, I got a thing that has a 1% chance to cure this, and there's something out there that has a 90% chance already. Why the hell should we let you patent this thing, or let you sell this thing in the US? But for a lot of these antibiotics, or potentially new antibiotics, the issue isn't that, sure, I've got something that may only be 80% as effective as what's out there now. But what's out there now will stop working in the near future, and 80% is a hell of a lot better than 0. So our standards are actually prohibiting the development of antibiotics, and the non-inferiority thing is probably something that we need to create an amendment to or change. Otherwise, it's going to continue to limit that development. Third is limited public funding for R&D. Like almost all final development of drugs is done by private companies. The government, through the NIH, does a lot of basic development type stuff, but doesn't do any of the finalization. And this is an example. Antibiotics are much more a public good than they are a personal product to have, if that makes sense. And so public funding to create them, because they aren't all that profitable, may be the only real way to go. But part of the other issue is this process, no matter how you do it, takes a long time, and we are running out of time in a real big hurry here. Last issue. I promise not to preach here for very long. I will be happy to debate ad nauseum this condition with anyone and everyone who would like to, who is willing to actually read the scientific journals that I give them. The evidence is functionally overwhelming, both among the scientific community and at large, that human activity is contributing in a significant way to the changing climate of the planet. We can quibble about exactly how much, exactly what ways, how different chemicals compare to one another, but on the whole, what we're doing is making changes, and we can see the effects already. Best case scenario. And this is what the Paris climate deal was trying to go for. We prevent the Earth from warming more than 2 degrees Celsius. That is our best case scenario. There's almost no chance we're going to get that. We are probably going to end up somewhere like twice that much, around 4 degrees Celsius or more, based on our current track. Well, actually, our current track has us even higher than that because we're not doing anything, and we're undoing things that we had previously done that would combat it. So let's assume a miracle happens, and tomorrow everybody changes what they're doing, and we somehow decide that we fight climate change and we cap everything at 2% or 2 degrees. Even at 2 degrees, the impacts are pretty significant from a health perspective. Here are the specific things to consider. Rising sea level is not just an annoyance, it leads to mass migration. There are literal island nations that cease to exist. Those people have to go someplace. Remember back when we talked about the developing world and how migration causes problems? Same sort of thing applies here, but on a global scale. Second, extreme weather, natural disasters. We've seen larger, wetter hurricanes that stick around for longer. While you can't take any one particular event and say, oh, that's climate change. Climate change makes all of those things both more frequent and generally more intense when they occur, largely because the warmer atmosphere means water stays in the atmosphere more. You know how when it gets cold, your lips get really chapped, right? Anybody? Am I the only one this happens to? Like, it's cold outside and it's really dry. Cold air doesn't hold moisture as well. So the warmer the air is, the more moisture it holds. The more moisture it holds, the more moisture there and rain and water there is in the air to dump when the hurricane gets to land. Also, the longer the hurricane stays going and the bigger it can get. So even small changes make a massive difference when you magnify them across hundreds and thousands of miles of ocean. In addition to that, changes in rainfall and temperature inevitably are going to lead to significant amounts of famine. What parts of the planet are farmable will change, and what's required to farm those areas will change as well. That changeover is probably something we can deal with, but the disruption and the time it takes to shift from farming one place to farming 1,000 miles away to the north of that is going to be a generation or two at least, and massive famine is likely there. Malnutrition, an inevitable follower on that. Remember also what we said about famine leading to conflict and creating problems there. We have the Defense Department views climate change as one of the single most significant threats to US national security because they view it as a conflict multiplier. It is a thing that makes every conflict we have worse and makes most fights more likely to happen. In addition to that, forest fires. You've seen this in California, right? It doesn't mean there are no forest fires without climate change, but it means the ones that we have burn longer, go out, take longer before they go out, and do more damage while they're around. That creates a ton of respiratory issues for people in the area and people generally. Beyond that, though, changing habitats. This gets to what you were talking about, where what are called transmission vectors move. Transmission vectors are the way a disease gets from one place to another. Mosquitoes, ticks are your classic ones. So specifically, mosquitoes, which transmit the single most deadly disease on the face of the planet in terms of sheer numbers. Malaria, in addition to fun things like dengue fever, West Nile, triple E, Eastern equine encephalitis, because me talk good, yellow fever, Zika, you name it. Mosquitoes are tremendously deadly. And the diseases they threaten, they transmit, and the types of mosquitoes that can live places are already beginning to shift further and further north and are going to continue to do so. Again, they need wet, moist environments to survive. Guess what happens when things are warmer and moister? More of them. Yep. In addition, ticks. You may have heard about how ticks have been moving further and further north in a lot of places. Climate change is one of the primary drivers behind that because the area there is more habitable than it was before for them. That means Lyme disease expands, which can have significant effects on folks. Water-related illness is a whole other area. Ocean surface temperature changes do a couple things. It means that toxic algae and what are called cyanobacteria, the things that live on the surfaces of water and release a lot of different toxic chemicals in them that can be super poisonous and bad, those you get more and more of because the surface of the water is warmer and can support that life more than it could before in areas it couldn't earlier, partially because of them and partially because of pH changes in the water and the death of things called phytoplankton, which are very small organisms that a lot of smaller fish feed on, which are then eaten by bigger fish, which are eaten by bigger fish, which are eaten by big things that we catch and eat. When those die, you end up with a lot of the fish and shellfish population either dying or changing. Up in Maine, one of the main reasons that things like Maine lobster are having trouble is not just overfishing, though that's a component. Cod also having a similar problem. The population as a whole is decreasing at a disproportionate rate to the rate at which fishing has increased, and it's because that habitat is becoming less conducive to that species because of very small but significant changes in the water in which they live. And there's a huge portion, close to a third of the world's population relies on fish for their daily diet. So as soon as that changes, you thought famine was a problem before, you have no idea. Increased air temperature, this is another one I actually hadn't thought about much, but increased air temperature leads to increased ground ozone concentration. You may have heard about like the ozone layer, right? Back in the day, that was a big deal. It still kind of is. It's way up in space and prevents horrible, bad, toxic gamma rays and stuff from getting in and frying us down here on planet Earth. Ozone way up top, good. Ozone down here, bad. Ozone is it's when 3 oxygen molecules bind together. It's not good to breathe in, and that leads to tons of premature deaths from respiratory disease. The CDC is estimating tens of thousands over the next 20 years or so, based on increased concentrations. So, climate change matters for health. Is that point kind of coming through a little? I may not have hit that hard enough. Can I make a bigger deal there? Go for it.
This is really depressing.
Oh, we're about to get to the fixing.
Oh, okay, good.
Last slide I have is how we fix this.
Okay, so one question is, what kind of time frame are we looking at for these kinds of things? Is your-
This, negative 10 years. So like, it's been going on. All of these have been going. The mass migration thing, probably have a decade or two. There are two components. One is how long we have to stop it. The second is how long before it manifests, because the Earth is a really, 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 really big thing. So anything that we do affecting it takes a long time to build up. There's a ton of inertia there. So the most recent reports that came out, both from the UN and from the US government itself, have told us we got a little over a decade, between 10 and 20 years, 12 years is what the UN said, to really act to make a difference, or we're screwed.
And we're screwed by when? We're screwed in 12 years?
In 12 years, it will become prohibitively difficult for our activities now to head off the shift to up to 4 degrees of warming. All of these are things that we can expect at 2 degrees of warming. It'll probably take about, depending on the thing, it'll take different amounts of time to manifest. So for example, extreme weather is already manifesting. That's just going to, a lot of these things are things that go up gradually, but they keep going. So the further out you get, the worse all of them get. There's not a point where like a big Hollywood movie happens and everything explodes. It's more a ramp up to death and destruction and horribleness. Forest fires, we're already seeing the increased thing there. The changing arid land area, we already saw that in Syria, and that's part of what created the famine there, which created the Syrian civil war. So these things are happening on a smaller level now. It's just they keep multiplying and happening more frequently and more intensely with every year that goes by. Yeah?
People who are not in the layer of great decisions may not truly appreciate the first one, rising sea level. Great decisions, and I'm sure you saw the same video. They were interviewing someone from one of the island nations, and he was pointing out where he grew up as a kid, and it was about a couple of 100 yards offshore. So where he grew up as a kid is now 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, underwater. And so that's actually happening right now as we speak.
And
losing their homes, their towns, their islands.
This is the challenge of the next century. This is the challenge of the next 20 years, because after that, it's all about trying to survive it instead of trying to stop it or slow it down. So let's talk about how we can actually do that, because I don't want to leave on a bad note, because there is hope, and there are a bunch of different options. I have 4.5 minutes of hope. So here you go. First off, got to cut fossil fuel use. This absolutely has to happen. There is no alternative. If we keep burning carbon at the rate we are burning it now, we are a word I can't say here.
Tell that to China.
That's someplace we're going to get here. So that needs to happen globally. In terms of order of what is best or worst, coal is the absolute worst fuel we have available. It creates the most pollution. It's also the thing the US has the most of, which is a problem for us. Oil is better than coal, but not by a ton. Natural gas is better than both of them. So in that way, fracking, while it may have some other concerns, has been very good in this direction, because using natural gas is better than using coal from this perspective, though it's still nowhere near enough. But that's got to happen. Second, we have to vastly accelerate renewable technology. This is something we need to look at creating renewable resources, renewable energy, the same way we looked at creating an army and a military for World War II. Like, this is an issue of existential existence for our nation that requires the kind of mobilization that we've shown when faced with those threats when they were people we didn't like. Now, we are the threats in some ways if we don't change. It requires a similar kind of mobilization. Energy storage tech is actually a really interesting and huge part of this, because we can create stuff that absorbs energy really well, but especially like solar panels, right? The sun doesn't always shine. You need to be able to store up enough energy during the day and to use it during night. So a lot of the barrier for a ton of renewable tech is battery technology, which is something we're getting better at, but we could do a lot more with if we diverted other budgets to doing that instead of developing other things. There's actually a really interesting idea of doing storage with gravitational technology. Talk to me at the end if you want to know more. It involves lifting rocks up. I actually think we need to expand nuclear power use. I'll break from the left on this one. I think that nuclear power has problems and it has particular risks to it, but I think from a political perspective, it's something that you are more likely to be able to get support from the conservative end of America on, and without joint support, we don't get anywhere. So I think that it's something that, again, is not my preference, but I think it probably needs to be part of the mix in terms of what we do, because it is carbon neutral, even though it does create other problems that are worth discussing. We need to implement, I think, some sort of a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. There basically needs to be an economic cost to carbon. So right now, if I'm a company and I pollute a bunch, the government will eventually say, hey, the law says you can't do that. Now you have to pay to clean it up and possibly get other fines. The way a carbon tax, or cap and trade we won't get into because it's a little more complicated, but the way a carbon tax would work is whenever and usually there's like a minimum threshold. If you're below a certain amount of carbon, you don't pay anything. But once you start putting out I know I'm trying to go fast, Danny. Once you're putting out a bunch of carbon, for every additional metric ton of carbon you create, you got to pay $50 or whatever. And so now, if I, as a company, I got two choices. I can produce my widgets I can produce them $2 a piece and make a metric ton of carbon per widget. Right now, that's the way to go because the carbon costs me nothing. Or I can produce them for $3 a piece and produce no carbon. Right now, I'll do the $2 in carbon all day long. Post-carbon tax, now there's an economic reason for me to do the slightly more expensive but non-carbon intensive way. So there has to be, this can't all be government fiat. There has to be a free market involved, and this I think is part of how you need to create an incentive in that market to value, or at least put weight on the effect that they're having. Third, we need to, and this is where you're going, so we need to negotiate some sort of compromise. BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They're sort of the rising tier of nations in the world right now. We've got to negotiate some kind of compromise with them to both, and with developing nations, to lower their emissions and recognize that we already got all the benefits of doing the dirtiest, most horrendously environmentally destructive method of economic development ever. Like the Industrial Revolution, Europe and the US, we did a ton of damage to the world and we advanced a ton because of that. Now everybody else wants to do the same thing we did, and we realize, oh wait, that was bad. We get to do it, but you don't. No. And this is why most of the world is like, dude, not cool. You got to, why don't we? But if we're going to survive, we've got to find some way to make that happen, which means the US probably has to pay out. We need to help with cost sharing. We already got the benefits of doing stuff that we now know is bad. If we're going to stop other people from doing it, we have to do something to make up for that in some way and level the playing field. How we negotiate that, that's going to be sticky as hell. But if it doesn't happen, we're going to have major issues. Next, trees are your friend. In particular, Brazil. Keep an eye on what Bolsonaro wants to do with the rainforest there. Brazil's been cutting it away for a while. Bolsonaro has talked about, the new president there, wants to significantly accelerate deforestation there to make more land for cattle and agriculture. Something that didn't make it onto my list that should. We need to actually eat less meat, in particular beef. Cows fart and they produce a lot of methane. And methane is actually incredibly destructive as a climate change element. I know it's weird, but it's totally true. Look it up, I actually highly encourage you to. But bulldozing rainforest, which is a great carbon sink, and putting in its place cows, which is a great carbon producer, is a bad equation. We kind of need to deal with that on both ends. Fuel efficiency standards in vehicles and mass transportation are both more easily agreed upon, more general consensus ways to get us there, but they won't get us as far as we need to go alone. This includes things like hybrid cars, electric cars, more rail, high-speed rail and otherwise. We move a lot of freight by truck Right now, moving that freight by train instead is significantly more efficient. And it's something that we don't do because it's not quite as, it's more expensive. Well, it's actually not more expensive. It is in some ways. We don't do it now and we need to. Sorry, low on time. Last, and this is the final point for me. This is going to cost us money. We got the benefits of being the preeminent country in the world economically for a long ass time. And now the bill is coming due. And I think and this is, again, me stepping into advocacy mode, but I think that it is troubling to try to dodge that bill and claim that we get the benefits and no one else in the world does. And as someone who hopes to live on this planet for a while, especially from my generation and the one that follows me, the future looks pretty grim if we don't pay the piper for the choices we've made. Fortunately, I think we actually can. It's going to be a question of governance, it's going to be a question of industry, and a question of advocacy. But I do think it's the kind of shift that can happen. We've done it when facing catastrophes like the Great Depression before. We can do it here as well. Yay, healthcare.